Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Harry Mai, and welcome to today's Auckland Climate Festival webinar, in which we will discuss the opportunities and challenges for Tāmaki Makaurau Auckland in transitioning to a low carbon, resilient and inclusive economy. This session is being recorded, so please mind your P's and Q's, and will be available later on online to play back if you want to share with any colleagues. Ko John Lavery, Toko Inawa. My name is John Lavery and I'm the chair of today's session. Before we get into it, I'm going to pass over to one of our panelists who I will introduce in more detail shortly, Tanya Poffery, to open the session for us with a karakia. Tanya.
Kia ora, John. Ko te metua tahi he mihi nui ki ngā mana whenua o inai maunga, inai moana, inai whenua o Tāmaki Herenga Waka Herenga Tangata. Tēnei te mihi ki a koutou, ko koutou te korowai o tēnei rohi, tēnā koutou. Ki te tine mate e rere atu, ki hiwaiki nui, hiwaiki roa, hiwaiki paumamao. Ka tangita ngākau, he muri aroha mō koutou. Moi mai rā hi te moinga roa. Kia koutou te hunga ora, he mihi mahana, kia koutou katoa. Me timatana tō tātou hui ki te karakia. Whakataka te hau ki tūru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mākina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai, e hiake ana te atakura. He tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei, mauri ora.
Kia ora, Tanya. Kia ora, Tanya. Thank you very much for that. A lovely opening to set up today's session. As I mentioned previously, my name is John Lavery and I am the Head of Economic Transformation with Tāmaki Auckland Unlimited. Today's session is brought to you by Tāmaki Auckland Unlimited and Climate Connect Aotearoa. Tāmaki Auckland Unlimited is an Auckland Council controlled and Auckland's economic and cultural agency. My role sits within the investment and industry ROPU, one of 4 ROPU within the organisation, which is focused on playing an enabling and facilitatory role in Auckland's economic development. Specifically, my team and I are focused on identifying, championing and supporting economic transformation opportunities in Auckland, with a particular focus on industry, place and working closely with colleagues in Climate Connect Aotearoa on the shift to a low carbon economy. Climate Connect Aotearoa is funded through the Auckland Council long-term plan and is being brought to life by Tāmaki Auckland Unlimited. It is a national centre for collaborative climate innovation to drive systems transformation for a climate resilient and low carbon Tāmaki Makaurau. It's actually being formally launched tomorrow with a launch event tomorrow evening. So keep an eye out for that around social media, etc. But if you want more detail, you can visit climateconnectnz.com and have a look at what those guys are about in a bit more detail. So we have a superb panel of super smart. I was a bit intimidated when I had a read of their bios and their CVs. Passionate and knowledgeable individual on today's panel. So I'll quickly kick in and introduce, then I'll lead them with some opening comments, and then we'll get into the discussion. So first up, you've already heard from her, is Tanya Poffery. Tanya is the General Manager of Social Innovation at the Social Innovation Department in Auckland Council. Her background is in women's rights, but since returning to Aotearoa after more than a decade in the UK and Ireland, I was very pleased to hear. She has primarily led the department's economic development portfolio. She is a senior fellow with the Atlantic Fellowship for Social Equity and an honorary fellow of Engineering New Zealand. She is also co-chair of the Maori Economic Development Advisory Board and a member of Tukahu Mate WorkSafe Partners Council. Kia ora, Tanya, great to have you here. Next up, we have Barry Anderson. Barry is the General Manager of Sector Analysis in the Climate Change Commission. Prior to joining the Commission, Barry has held a variety of roles in the Alberta government in Canada. Many moons ago, Barry spent years of his life researching emissions trading schemes, which resulted in a doctorate from the University College in Dublin. A strong Irish theme on the call today, I'm pleased to see. Thirdly, we have Gary Blick. Gary is Auckland Council Chief Economist. Gary is committed to evidence-based economic advice to help improve the livability and prosperity of Auckland. He's almost 20 years experience as an advisor, including with the Treasury and as a consulting economist. And Gary has advised central and local government clients on policy trade-offs, including cost-benefit analysis across a range of policy areas, including health and the resource management space. And last but not least, joining us from the UK, dialing in at midnight over there, we have Rosie Collins. Rosie is an economist at Sense Partners, a New Zealand-based economic consultancy firm. She holds an MPhil from the University of Cambridge and has previously worked for the Reserve Bank of New Zealand and International Energy Agency. Her two passions are climate and savings policies, but she also has an interest in housing, financial inclusion, energy and transport. In 2021, Rosie was awarded the inaugural Dr. Ed Hernshaw Prize for Economics and the Environment for her essay Flexi Work, and she is passionate about economics grounded in collective well-being, justice and ecological reality. I think you'll be in good company here today, Rosie. So thank you to all our panelists. Before I open, I'll just provide some, or hand over to panelists, I'll just provide some opening comments and context. So globally, we need to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. This is required to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, identified as the maximum sustainable level of warming and as the goal of the Paris Agreement. Transitioning to a low carbon economy is key to achieving this goal. Our economy, how we produce and how we consume, has long been fossil fuel driven and generates a range of negative externalities which have contributed hugely to the temperature increases we have realised since the 1800s and to the inequities that we see in our economy today. Getting to net zero will require a significant abatement of greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors of the economy. In Tāmaki Makaurau Auckland, we are different to other parts of New Zealand. Our urban nature, the scale of our population and our industrial mix means we face different emissions challenges. Where the rest of New Zealand are primarily focused on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, our emissions are dominated by three broad areas: transport, stationary energy, and heavy industrial processes. Transport, which accounts for almost 44% of our emissions, includes private vehicle use, freight and aviation, those transport modes which support the movement of people and goods into and around our city and region and which enable economic activity to occur. Stationary energy, which accounts for almost 27% of our emissions, is a combination of keeping the lights on in our homes, business premises, or entertainment venues, and process energy from goods manufacturing. Heavy industrial processes, which represents almost 20% of our emissions, which is largely dominated by steel manufacturing, is those heavy industries, those outputs from heavy industries. Our population in Tāmaki is also different. We are more diverse and we have a larger Maori, Pacific and ethnic minority populations. And like many other large urban areas, we have significant proportions of our population who are struggling and places within our region which are not prospering. This has been highlighted in work over the last number of years, including work by Tāmaki Auckland Unlimited around our prosperity index and other work taken by colleagues in TSI. And we have Tanya here today representing TSI. Nationally and at an Auckland level, the policy frameworks are in place. The Climate Change Response Amendment Act and National Adoption Plan and Auckland's Climate Plan to Taraki Atafari have been in place for a number of years now. These are supported by sectoral emissions reduction plans, including the Transport Emission Reduction Pathway in Auckland, recently published, and other government and council schemes. But the pressure is on. We are already at 1.2 degrees Celsius warming, and with our current policies and actions, we are on a path to over 3 degrees warming. It's also estimated that to meet 2050 net zero targets, emissions need to fall by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, which is just over 7 years away. This is a change at pace like never before seen and will require changes in behaviours for firms, individuals and across all sectors. And this is at a time when there's existing unease globally and in Tāmaki Makaurau, emerging from the world emerging from a bruised COVID environment. But the change will also bring opportunity to innovate, to improve health outcomes, and to move away from extractive models which create inequities. There is no choice but to change. Some estimates suggest that if we stay on our current trajectory, we could see between 3 to 4 degrees level of warming, and at 4 degrees, it is forecast that the planet would only be able to support, sustain and feed a global population of 1 billion as compared to today's population of almost 8 billion. And that for me is an alternative that really doesn't bear thinking about. So with that cheery note, we'll open and we'll hand over to our panelists. And we'll just like to lead out with a question for all panelists, which I'll put to each of the guys on screen here. It is 2050, and the Mayor of Auckland has declared that we have achieved our net zero target, and we are now a net zero carbon city and region. Panelists, on that day in 2050, for you, what does Tāmaki Makaurau look like? And I'll ask Rosie, joining us from London, to open on that one, please.
I'm rubbing my hands a little bit here because it's quite cold. We haven't turned the heating on with the gas shortages and things like that. But kia ora koutou katoa, ko Rosie toku ingoa, ngā mihi ki koutou, and ko tēnei taku mihi ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohi nei. Climate change is widespread, rapid and intensifying. That's how it was described by the IPCC in 2021. We've got evidence to show that Tāmaki Makaurau is going to be getting hotter. It'll be becoming a city of severe yearly drought and intense wet weather and floods in spring, and it will experience regular coastal inundation. This we already know and have locked in from previous emissions that the world has emitted. Across Aotearoa, the picture is similar. 1 in 7 live in already flood-prone homes, and 72,000 homes and $22 billion of government assets alone will be affected by sea level rise in the next 100 years. How quickly we respond to climate change now is all that really matters from an economic perspective. The first thing you learn in economics before you get to the demand and supply curves is scarcity, and we live in extremely scarce times. We're scarce on time to transition, and we're scarce on safe wiggle room to emit any more, if any. So when economists talk about the cost of the transition, we also need to talk about how fulsomely and over what time periods those costs are counting, and also of the costs of inaction and who are already bearing those costs of inaction. Acting soon will save lives and species, and it will prevent an onslaught of adaptation costs that are already locked in. For Tāmaki Makaurau, net zero 2050 for me ultimately means that there is no more housing crisis. I'm going to focus on that today. 33% of the New Zealand population lives in Auckland, and it's a city that contributes 30% of our household emissions. Just under half of those are from transport, and the next are from third is from buildings. The most aspirational I think we can be when we think forward to 2050 is that we can imagine a world where we don't have people unable to afford housing in their own city. As long as we continue to build housing that's large, energy efficient, built away from the centre and in low-lying areas, we will continue to fail our climate obligations. For me, when I think about the treats of the transition and what we can look forward to, it should be seen as more foot traffic from denser living, a more diverse, healthy and local workforce who can actually afford to invest in their skills because they're not living in the dysfunction of poverty. And for the construction sector, an incredibly sustained time of boom spread across extreme infrastructure, retrofitting and housing sector needs. At the moment, we're about 100,000 people across the country too short to deliver what the construction sector needs to for us to get to 2050 and achieve net zero. So net zero 2050 also means a much stronger and much more efficient construction sector. This for me is politically useful, but it's also politically terrifying. It means if we don't achieve one, we don't achieve the other and vice versa. So I think it puts a lot of political risk into the housing sector. So I guess the best case scenario is we've returned to affordable rentals come 2050.
Thank you, Rosie. That was super.
Great.
We'll hand over to Tanya for your perspective on what Tāmaki Makaurau could look like in 2050 if we achieve our net zero target.
Tēnā koe, John. Tēnā koutou anō. Ko Tania Pauwharea Hauhuru no ngai tūhoi. Kia ora again, everyone. Normally I'm the one delivering the hellfire and brimstone story, but I'm taking a different pathway today, and I'm going to transport myself into 2050, and we have an economy of mana. We've achieved that ruptural change to scale up the capacity for all of us to live fair and well. And we have what Naomi Klein describes as experience, worked together and achieved rapid collective change. We've combined socioeconomic justice with climate justice because we know that we cannot have one without the other. Rangatiratanga and social economic equity on a dead planet is a hollow victory indeed, but achieving our net zero target without improving the significant inequality that plagues our city is just green colonialism. And so we've 2050, and we've forged a new metabolic relationship between Te Taiao, the natural world, labour, capital and consumption. And our economy produces thickly woven social fabric. It prioritises infrastructure for collective joy rather than privatised leisure, privatised ownership and consumption. We are the world's experts in economic gardening, and we are growing plentiful opportunities where Māori and Pacifica are the designers and the protagonists of our new system, and not the passive consumers, labour fodder or victims of it. We have buried the zombie that of the economy that we live in now, and we have buried it for good. We prioritise productivity for human dignity, and that has replaced the idea of never-ending extraction for unending growth. And it's not just extraction from our natural world and then we spew it out in waste and carbon emissions. But for well over 40 years, the city has treated places like South Auckland as a reservoir of cheap brown labour from which to extract from. So it's 2050, and we've got an economy as late Professor Mānuka Henare envisioned, and it's an economy where people see themselves as part of Te Taiao, as part of the natural world, not dominion over it. We've disrupted the capital rentier versus labour dichotomy. Toi, the arts, mātauranga, and caring are valued in the economy. The collective counts, and collective altruism counts, not homo economicus. Whakapapa thinking is our norm, not short-termism. Abundance thinking is our norm, not the false scarcity of the market. Distribution is what matters, and accumulation has no social license. We just don't tolerate that as a norm. Mana enhancing behaviour characterises the flows between the different stocks, and reciprocity and balance are prioritised. We've got an economy that creates belonging and connection. And this forms the social license that is now baked in, so that it endures generations. We need what a Native American economist, Rebecca Adamson, calls an economy of enoughness. Everyone should have enough, but I think there's a really interesting provocation that she puts in there, and that but neither should anyone have too much. And I always think that actually, how have we enabled policies, and other interventions that have enabled such a small group of people to get so far away from the rest of us? So in summary, we've got an economy that enhances mana, it enhances dignity, and it enhances mana motuhake of ordinary people in our natural world. And not only did we have the wherewithal to envision something, like the imagination to envision this in the first place, but we have the wherewithal to actually achieve it as well. And that's my hope. It's my letter to 2050. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Tanya, and what a letter, what an aspiration. You know, productivity for human dignity. It's a line I really like, and the concept of a new social license. And I'm sure there'll be some discussion around that as we progress in the discussion today. Barry, can you give us your thoughts on what 2050 could look like?
Sure thing, John. Kia ora, everyone. My name is Barry Anderson, as introduced. Just a bit of a disclaimer. I'm not one of the climate change commissioners. They are a group of 8 that are political appointees. I'm one of the foot soldiers in the secretariat. So I'm going to share with you the results of a thought exercise that I played with my teams on account of previously released work in Aitonene from 2021. That was our advice to government for the first emissions reductions plan and 3 sets of budgets. This was a really great question, John. What does 2050 look like? We spend a lot of time rooting around to try to figure out what we know and what we don't know to make good policy recommendations to the government at a strategic level, because that is our raison d'etre. But this was a good thought experiment to sit back and go, whoa, if all this works and we end up on our demonstration path from an Aitonene, what does it look like on the other side of that ribbon cutting ceremony in 2050 from the Auckland mayor? And so I'm going to just give you the collection of thoughts that the team put together. So in a nutshell, you'll probably have a greater sense of well-being and as a result of being healthier and more economically comfortable than you would have been in the absence of achieving net zero in 2050. The reason for saying that is there's just an absolute boatload of research pointing out the health and wellness benefits for more active modes of transport, whether it's walking or cycling or any other thing, rather than just sitting in a single passenger vehicle. Furthermore, in an increasingly carbon-constrained economic future, I'm going to quote my often quoted chair, Rod Carr, high emissions lifestyles and employment that depends on high emissions activities are going to become increasingly vulnerable. For me, that's pithy and memorable enough that it really sticks. And the other thing is, you'll, on a personal level in 2050, you'd probably be feeling a lot more well-rested and healthy than you would otherwise, because your home is likely to be warmer, drier, and more energy efficient than it would have been in the absence of actions that lead you at net zero. Aside from all that, you'll probably have a greater sense of freedom of movement, both around the city and the region surrounding, since there's been a shift in the run-up to 2050 from not passenger vehicles to alternative forms of transport, whether it's e-bikes, e-scooters, walking, and then probably also the integration of such last kilometer approaches to bigger mass transit integrated systems.
Like, we may have just lost Barry there midway through his aspiration. We'll maybe give it a second and see if he comes back in. No. Oh, no. We've lost Barry. Let's hope he comes back in and maybe we can finish off. So maybe Gary, we can hand over to you. Lucky last, but I'm sure plenty to build off there, Gary.
Yeah, kia ora koutou. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity. Well, I think by 2050, if we've achieved our net zero target, from an Auckland perspective, I'd hope that we would have implemented interventions to realise the transport emissions reduction pathway, which Auckland Council committed to just a couple of months back. And so we would have realised our aim in that pathway of reducing our transport emissions by 64% by 2030, and then remaining on a low emissions path thereafter in terms of our transport sector. And that would have been a key part of fulfilling our Auckland Climate Plan, Tātariki Tāwhiri, which has the core goal of reducing emissions by 50% by 2030 and then net zero by 2050. So sort of my vision for 2050, I think we'll see planning decision makers will have been and continue to use the transport emissions reduction pathway to guide plans and investment, not only for transport, but also for land use. We'll have transport emissions being reduced by giving people better choices to shift modes around in terms of how they get around. So it envisages 5 times the number of people making transport trips, or I should say 5 times the number of trips taken by public transport. And in order to get there, we'll need to have invested in a 3-fold increase in our public transport services. I think we'll also have seen a large uptake in active modes in terms of people walking and cycling to get around, and we will have reduced reliance on cars. I think it's also useful to focus on, or important to focus on, what will have changed with our land use. My sort of vision is that we will have made more efficient use of our land, particularly our current urban land that's in high demand, and that land tends to be closer to things that people value. So that's less about shifting the mode, but giving people the opportunity to avoid trips by allowing households to locate, in those high demand locations which have proximity to things that people value, and that's typically jobs, perhaps public transport networks, and amenities like schools and shops. I think it's also important to keep in mind that while the focus is on reducing emissions, a lot of the benefits, there's a lot of co-benefits alongside that. So we've been doing some economic analysis to think about, what are the benefits and the costs of the transport emissions reduction pathway, the TERP, and sort of findings, at a high level that I can share at the moment would be that the sort of co-benefits alongside the benefit of reducing emissions are significant and probably at least as large, if not larger, than how we would value the reduction in emissions. And those other co-benefits take the form of reduced air pollution and the consequential avoided impact on people's health. Also, the uptake of active modes. So the increase in walking and cycling also has significant health gains for people who are more active than otherwise would be the case. And then, of course, we've got the reduced resource costs from fewer trips or reduced vehicle kilometres being taken. So I can think about that all in terms of enhancements to our human capital, enhancements to our environmental capital in terms of air and water quality, and then potentially social capital too, with more connected communities. So there's some thoughts for me as an opening gambit. And do we have Barry back?
We do. Thank you, Gary. Really thinking about following through on policy, and it's a theme that I think we'll all agree with. Barry, you were cut off mid flow, so would you like to give us a couple of minutes to finish off?
Sure. Sorry about that.
No problem.
I guess that's life in the virtual age, right? So I think maybe just the important part to pick up, I heard the tail end of what Gary said there as I log back in. So at the risk of being repetitive, instead, I think it's worth pointing out that around Auckland in the future, you'll probably see a lot more green infrastructure to help with resiliency against new weather patterns and the emergence of surface water and other impacts from weather events. The other probably noticeable thing around the landscape would be there'll probably be a lot more green spots due to regeneration of native bush, and also likely an increase of exotic trees plantation that are part of a vibrant bioeconomy. Unfortunately, by 2050, you and your family will likely still be facing the impacts of climate change, just due to the fact that as of today, there are already some impacts that are baked in due to the warming that we've accrued to date and the follow through of that. The good news is that with the follow through of 2050 net zero compliant policies and actions, your home and your workplace will likely be built to enable you to safely live in a changing climate, and your family and community will be supported by systems that support you so that you can anticipate, avoid, cope, and recover from events and shocks that happen in that kind of wetter, wilder, windier world of the future.
Super. Thank you very much, Barry. Great you could jump back in to join us. So, look, a real breadth of themes there. We we have at the kind of more practical end of things, following through on existing policy. We have discussions around more, better housing, improved quality of housing, better transport choices, improved land use, a new social contract, and really thinking about addressing the inequities that exist today, and shifting away from that model that Tanya highlighted. And then the discussion around benefits that will accrue from reduced carbon emissions, health benefits, air quality benefits, etc. So really broad discussion. Moving on to the second question for our panelists. And as I mentioned, and Gary's touched on this as well, we do have policy frameworks in place, but the pace of change in Auckland and in New Zealand has been, commentators said it's been slow, and there's a sense that we are behind. Other international cities, such as Vancouver, have focused on becoming a green city, and over the last number of years have achieved a 17% reduction in their emissions, a 30% decline in private car use, and an 86% growth in green jobs. But they themselves also feel that they are behind, and they are facing an uphill battle. So panelists, you've given us your aspiration and your view of what Tāmaki Makaurau could be in 2050. So how do we get there? What's the pathway to go forward on that? I think of this time, given Gary was last, we'll give Gary a chance to open on this question.
Thanks, John. So what's it going to take to get there? Well, ideally we'd want pricing signals that price in the externalities in terms of emissions as environmental costs. And I guess we can say that we've got a market failure, and there's attempts to address that through central government with emissions trading scheme, and at a local government level, Auckland's, as I mentioned, is focused on reducing transport emissions, and we've set out the pathway. So I think it's going to take some investment in the infrastructure needed to accommodate high levels of PT service. Talked about needing to have 3 times the capacity in terms of a reliable, frequent, rapid public transport service. I think it's important to put that in perspective. There are sort of long-term plans for investment in infrastructure, and so some of that really is not new money, but spending that would otherwise happen being brought forward, particularly between now, the 8 years we've got until 2030 to hit that target of reducing emissions by 64%. So we can think about reallocating road space in terms of extending our bus priority network across all of the arterial routes on the isthmus and further out, not only the radial routes to and from the city centre, but also the orbital routes that connect across. I think our rail network will need to improve the capacity there on the lines that we have. You've got to protect capacity for freight movements, but also enable a more frequent, metro service for passengers. So there's probably going to have to be some, well, in the long term, there'd be quadrupling of tracks on the southern line and probably the western line as well. And so some of that would have to be brought forward if you want to be talking specifically about infrastructure. And of course, there are program business cases already done which have long-term visions for walking and cycling networks, and some of that looks unfunded at the present point, or there isn't a commitment for it to happen before 2030, and so some of that will have to be brought forward and committed to. I think in terms of land use, the Auckland's future development strategy is available online and projects over 300,000 dwellings being needed over the next 30 years between now and 2050 to accommodate future households. And so we're going to need to see more of those dwellings being in locations where, as I mentioned earlier, where people want to live, which tend to be near the things they value, which are often, as I said earlier, jobs and transport links. And so we've probably got some trade-offs to weigh up about how we use the land that is already well located. And if it's not too presumptive of me, John, I might just flick a little picture up to see, to illustrate the concept, just making use of Teams here if I can.
Go for it, Gary.
Is that all right? Really sort of showing, if we take our land values, this is just a a portrayal of the rates rating base and the land values on a land parcel level, and then we can sort of zoom in. I can make it zoom. Well, it's not zooming for some reason. Let's have a look. There we are. So you can see a bit of a heat map in terms of the red areas are where land values are higher, and urban economic theory is pretty clear that the reason those land values are higher is because there are more households and businesses that want to locate in those areas, and so the attributes of those areas are really being capitalized into the land price. And we can see that particularly in the isthmus and around some of those town centres, you've got higher land values in general. And I guess we've got a trade-off to make in terms of how much of our future growth, in terms of those 300 dwellings, do we want to have in more peripheral areas, which are more likely to generate transport emissions, versus accommodating more of that growth in those more central areas where people often want to get to or locate themselves to, nearby to. And it's important to recognise Auckland has taken steps forward with its unitary plan, which enabled a lot more capacity or more intensive use of land, sometimes referred to as upzoning. And some of that happened around the edges of the isthmus a bit. And in the sort of 5 or 6 years since that plan's been in place, you can look to see the pattern of growth that we've had. And if I can just jump forward, this is probably a bit of detail, but if you just look at the colour blocks, if we look at all of the consenting of new dwellings since the plan's been in place, effectively since the start of 2017 to now, then those blue blocks, each of them represents a local board, and they are outer local boards off the isthmus, and that's where, if we've had sort of 90,000 odd dwellings consented, then 3/4 have been off the isthmus, and then we've got about 25% in those inner local boards. Now, if you go back to that map, a lot of the higher demand areas tend to be in more centrally located areas. So my sort of vision about how we get there, it is about investing in public transport to give people real choices. It is about investing in active modes to give people safer options for short trips, and we know that a lot of the trips that are taken are short and so lend themselves to more active modes. But it's also about a shift in our land use patterns, making sure that we've got the flexibility to use our well-located land and get more out of it, because that land is valued for its proximity to the things that people want, and inherently comes with the opportunity to reduce trips and to reduce the length of trips, and so the opportunity to reduce transport emissions. So I'll stop the show and tell.
Yeah.
And make sure I've left time for others to carry on.
Yeah, it's a slide I've seen before. It probably could be a good segue to hand over to Rosie, given there's an alignment there in your discussion, Rosie, around your aspiration around housing. Gary's quite hot on housing, land use, transport. So I'll pass to you, Rosie, on how do we get there?
Sure, I think if we're going to zoom out maybe to the central government level first, and we'll come back to local government. But in terms of where the central government sits with the levers they have, urban form is not something they've got particularly great control over compared to other markets. So a carbon price sort of through the ETS is particularly effective when things are price sensitive, but urban form isn't really one of those areas. There's really long lead times. We inherit old historic patterns of city use. There's infrastructure coordination issues. It's a wildly fragmented market where lots of people feel really strongly about the houses they live in. It's a speculative asset. So there's a plethora of reasons as to why urban form is not something that central government actually has a lot of control over, and they're also not the ones that deliver that local infrastructure. The current plans that we have in place with the emissions reduction plan does put a lot on councils and says councils need to ensure that their investments and spending align with climate objectives. But already this sort of, I guess, sets them up to fail in some ways, and that they don't have the actual funding and financing capabilities to meet the infrastructure gap that at a national level we're saying we have. So at a national level, we've got about $200 billion of infrastructure to either repair or build in the next 30 years, which would require roughly doubling what we spend on GDP to build our way out of it, which we can't do, and would take far too long and wouldn't even take into account the repairs that are necessarily needed. So there's a real mismatch still of central government ambition and actually how much they're letting local governments do. So no matter how good the policy documents at a local government level, without those, I guess, the teeth behind the plans and the levers to actually deliver at the scale and pace that we need, I think the pathways will be potentially seen as optimistic at present, without really thinking about how do we beef up local government and deal with the fact that politics at a local level are very adversarial. But part of it is also because we don't actually have any tools to deliver what local government needs to deliver, and that leads to weaseling out of national policy guidance. I'm not going to say which council is aware, it's just that there's a tendency for that to happen, and we've heard about that happening already with the new national policy statements. So I think the pathway the next 10 years is, yeah, we've got the frameworks at a central government level and we've got frameworks at a local government level, but there needs to be a lot more work done on the coordination and the actual mechanisms to deliver it so that we can move into the next stage of the pathway. Should we do that, then I think basically we can unlock a lot more density. I think local government's job then becomes the how and the what, but it doesn't become the should. I think the should, should we have public transport? Should we have dense housing, affordable housing in our city centres? That shouldn't be a choice for local councils. That's a must. But how we go about that is a deeply democratic local issue that we should be empowering local government bodies to manage. So, yeah, that's my that's my answer there.
Thank you, Rosie. And I know we have quite a few attendees from local government on the call today, and that probably resonates with them. And with the review of local government coming up, and I think the interim report's due soon, it'd be interesting to see what the perspective is and how local government is empowered to deliver some of this. So thank you.
Nice.
Just noting we have 15 minutes left. There is a Q&A box, and just a reminder, there is a Q&A box if anyone has any questions, and we'll hopefully grab a couple of minutes for questions at the time. But we'll hand over then to Tanya and then Barry for their perspectives on how we get there. So Tanya.
Yeah, so totally agree with the emphasis on public and active transport and land use and density and all of those things. One of the things that we're focusing on is a Green New Deal. So the idea taken from Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal response to the Great Depression is a massive mobilisation of pragmatic and experimental investment. And that Green New Deal is very targeted. So there are actually lots of Green New Deals across the world. There's Indigenous, there's working class, queer, state-led, citizen-led, and lots of other hybrids. But I think what cuts across all of them, and what makes it slightly different from just transition actually, is that social justice and climate justice are advanced as a singular mission. So it also recognises things like poor people, incarcerated people cannot fight climate change. So if we don't address those issues, then we have kind of failed to deliver a new type of economy that would benefit the greatest number of people, not just the people who can afford to be on the in their EV vehicles, etc. So this cannot just be about tinkering with market mechanisms on the outside, or pinning all of our hopes on lone hero tech entrepreneurs, or economic hunting for a green industry. So our vision for a Green New Deal is that it'd be a surge of investment into South and West Auckland, because that's where the overwhelming majority of Māori and Pacifica live, and that investment would go directly into Māori and Pacifica enterprise to build a new economy, a different type of economy. And we know that this is our best bet because all of the data tells us that. So, for example, Māori who are employers, so own their own business and employ others, are on parity in terms of income with Pākehā. Now, we don't see that anywhere else in terms of income. So there is something to unlock there around our enterprises, and they are privately owned enterprises. They make up the absolute bulk of what we would consider the Māori and Pacifica economy. So for us, investment into tackling the climate emergency, into environmental sustainability, it has to benefit the people who have experienced the worst of our current economy first and foremost. Or else, if we don't take this intentional equity approach, all we will do is increase the gap between Māori and Pacifica peoples and everyone else. You know, our country is in the top third of being most unequal in the OECD. Our Gini coefficient here in Auckland will be it'll be up near 60, right? We have a real problem with inequality, and I don't think that that's well understood. And if we don't tackle that as part of reducing our climate emissions, at some point we're going to be in trouble. The other thing that we need to recognise is that that type of investment into places like South Auckland has a direct knock-on effect to the Pacific Islands. So they are going to be ground zero of the climate emergency. Tuvalu has already lost 5 islands. We've got increasingly, you know, extreme weather events happening. So climate refugees from the islands are only going to come one place, and that is South Auckland. So we need to make sure that South Auckland has the financial means in their ainga, in their own homes, to be able to accommodate that. And yes, we need green jobs. Access to decent, low carbon jobs enable people to live with dignity. But I also want to point out that there are other industries that are already low carbon. So care economy is one of them, and we need to urgently raise the status and pay of people, and mostly women, mostly also brown women, in that economy, because that is the bedrock of a functioning economy. And we also need to invest in our creative economy, which is also low carbon. And it's good for our soul. It's the idea of, you know, not just bread, but roses too. One of the things that I think we need to stop doing is whenever we pump in economic stimulus, right, our go-to is infrastructure. And there is nothing inherently wrong in that, but it is a very, very narrow approach which limits who benefits. And it is mostly tilted towards men, right? Those shovel-ready projects. So what if we had, and Sonia Davies talked about this in the 1980s, what about if we actually had invested in rape crisis services and refuges? If we had done that in the 80s, we might not be one of the most dangerous countries to be a woman. So thinking about this more than just you know, housing, transport, and agriculture, and other things. When thinking about how we might optimise every single lever at our disposal at every single opportunity. One of the things that we're really passionate about is democratising wealth and capital and power. So things like digital equity, it needs to be considered to be a basic utility like clean water, affordable energy, and adequate housing. So I think there is a huge opportunity for us to embed a very, very deep focus on how our efforts not only can contribute to reducing carbon emissions and reducing waste, for example, but also at the same time rapidly increasing equity and equality at the same time.
Kia ora, Tanya. Thank you. Super, bringing that equity and social justice lens in and how we get there. I'll hand over to Barry for your perspective, Barry, and we can shift on to closing.
Sure. I'm going to give you the company line and then a personal reflection, just so you know what you're getting. The company line is that, you know, the Climate Change Commission is this boutique legislated mirror that holds up what, you know, you, the citizens of Aotearoa, want to do in the future. You know, it's our job to go out and hunt in the market for good ideas and prepare advice for emissions reduction plan, budgets, targets, and the like. So my solemn request for listeners on this call is to Google Climate Change Commission, our upcoming work program, and you'll see things that I'll not spend words on right now about the work that we're going to do in the next 2 to 3 years that are squarely in the space of what should we do about it now and tomorrow to land in the place where we want to be in 30 years. So that's the company line. And first out of the gate there is we have to give advice on the emissions reduction plan for 26 to 30. So we're going to be engaging on that early next year. And I guess I would count anybody that wants to spend their lunch hour listening to this kind of content would be engaged actors. And so please make use of the contact information on that link that pops up. And we'd like for you to be involved and bring your ideas to the space. On a personal matter, I have this set of axioms that I walk around with and am forced to view the world through when we think about climate action. So I'll just share those quickly. One, the first tranche of them are related to basically energy services. Whenever we think about policy development, I boil it down to where is there an energy service that is not electrified? In other words, electrify everything. You can think about the implications of that through transport, buildings, and the like. Once you get through that part, the next thing, of course, or maybe even before that, is to decarbonize the electricity supply. That's obvious. There's a heck of a rolling start here in New Zealand with the makeup of the current grid, but boy, oh boy, do we need more electrons in the next 30 years. Following on from that is to be very thoughtful and conserve those electrons to the greatest extent possible. That kind of thinking gets mapped onto the points raised earlier with urban form and transport. A lot of the results of those good land use decisions are more thoughtful use of the energy services. Following on from that, the reality, as you spoke to earlier, the emissions profile leads to the fact that there are some large point sources there. And so while it's tough to plan for unicorns, there is going to need to be some next-gen technology to decarbonize heavy industry. And whether that is better ways of doing the same things or end-of-pipe abatement technologies like carbon capture on top of cement plants and the like, where chemistry is mandating that CO2 emissions will exist. That's probably got to be in the portfolio of actions. And then lastly, I think is the nice push for the Climate Connect Etura initiative going on, is investing in research and innovation is necessary. We can get a long ways with being world-class adopters, but that'll only get us so far, and we need to be ready to put some skin in the game and be ready for those new green or the greener alternatives to the current practices of today. So I think I'll leave it there, John, and give you some time back.
Super, Barry. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists for a contribution today. We haven't had any questions, and assuming that is because people were just so enthralled in listening to the discussion and the views of our panelists. So I'll just give a quick summary of the discussion, and then we can hand back to Tanya to close us. So this was a discussion around opportunities and challenges around transitioning to a low carbon, resilient and inclusive economy. Some of the opportunities that have been identified clearly from Tanya, that alignment between climate and social justice and shifting the economic paradigm and dealing with some of the equity issues that we currently face. The ability to improve health outcomes through improved investment in infrastructure and land use, and improved land use and more compact city and improved housing outcomes for our citizens. The challenges, I think we're pretty aware that the challenges are many, but Gary was keen to highlight the trade-offs. So we need to make the need for bringing forward infrastructure investment to achieve the short-term targets to 2030 as outlined in the TERP. The energy supply targets and decarbonising our energy systems. And from in relation to Rosie's point, I think one was definitely resonated, is empowering local government to do on some of this that is required. So thank you everyone who tuned in. I think we get well over 50 who came online today, so it's a great audience. And Thanks to everyone. And I'd just like to hand over to Tanya to close us.
Kia ora John, kia ora koutou. Ko tai mai te wā ki te whakakapi tō tātou hui. He karakia mo tātou. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa paunamu te moana. Hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora. Thanks, guys. And we finished with a minute or two to spare.
Ka pai. Thanks
Kia ora.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.